Welcome to AML Conversations, the Solution Series. This podcast series focuses on practical information about solutions to challenges you face in your financial crime compliance program. These solutions include managed services, technology, advisory, and third-party risk management. You can access this series and other AML Conversations and This Week in AML podcasts at our website, amlrightsource.com, SoundCloud, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello and welcome to AML Conversations, the Solution Series. My name is Rachel Dettmer and I'm the Brand Content Manager for AML RightSource. In this episode, we're going to continue our discussion on implementation support, and I'm joined by our VPs of Financial Crime Advisory, Jonathan McIsaac and Joshua Gubitz, to do just that. Hi guys.
Hey Rachel, thanks so much for having us back.
Hi Rachel, glad to be back.
In our previous episode, we discussed the value of having an implementation support partner in addition to what the system vendor provides. In this episode, we will discuss why it's essential to choose a partner with experience and the benefits of this cumulative knowledge. I can think of a couple of hands, such as avoiding costly mistakes and having access to world-class expertise. But you two are in a much better position to answer this question. So, what are the benefits of an experienced implementation support partner?
I'll start us off and then I'll hand it over to John. So I think from a compliance perspective, there are usually three main goals that accompany a system implementation. And I'd like to talk about each of those three in turn. And those three, at least in my mind, are first and foremost, obviously, is managing your risk. And we'll talk about what that means and how we help with that. The second is documentation. And the third, which I think is often overlooked, relates more to the regulators and having a good story to tell the regulators. So let's dive into each one of those three in turn. So the first one I said is really managing your risk. And, one of the things that our experience helps us help customers with is to make sure that the systems they choose and the scenarios they choose within those systems adequately addresses the risks that that specific customer needs to address. And, no two financial institutions are exactly the same in terms of the risks that they have, the products they have, their location, and the specific risk profile of their products and their customers. So that needs to be taken into account. What also needs to be taken into account is the size of organization, the type of organization, what size IT staff they have, how much support and feeding and care they can give to the system. So all of these things need to be considered. And I guess just the breadth and depth of experience that a company like AML RightSource brings to the table really helps with that. And let me talk about some examples. There are an awful lot of different transaction monitoring systems and sanction screening systems and CDD systems out there. And part of what differentiates whether or not a system might be well suited to a specific organization is the complexity of the system and the complexity of the organization. So for example, system ABC, and I won't name any names, might be a fabulous system. It might be a world-class system, but it requires a huge amount of IT support. Well, if you're a very small shop with a very small or non-existent IT support staff, even though that system is great, it's probably not the right system for you because you simply won't have the IT support staff to feed and care for that system and maintain it the way it needs to be maintained. So thinking through things like this and helping our clients think through things like this is an enormous part of the value that we bring to the table based on all of the experience we have. Because if you're implementing a system for the first time, you might just say, hey, we have to go with the best system out there and that's what we need, and not think of all these other factors that you also should take into consideration. And the second piece of managing the risk is really being incredibly systematic about going through your products one by one, going through standard risk typologies, and making sure that you address them all as they relate to your products and your risks. So you really have to think through the detailed specifics of your products and your risks and make that line up with the system you're planning to implement and the scenarios you're planning to implement. And last but not least, on the managing your risk side, is the idea that you want to make sure that you're leading the effort in terms of what makes sense from the big picture. And let me explain what I mean there. I think it's really easy to fall into the trap of letting the system kind of lead you by the nose. And what I mean by that is people start implementing a system, there are all these IT and tech requirements, they get immediately deep, deep, deep into the weeds. And the problem with that is they don't necessarily then pull back and look at the really big picture at 80,000 feet and say, hey, what are we actually trying to achieve here? What are the main risks we're trying to address? What are the main gaps we're trying to fill? Let's think about that from a very high level and then start working our way slowly down to the system level, to the scenario level, to the tuning and threshold level. And what happens instead is people tend to dive into the very detailed work and not realize that the detailed work has to come kind of as the last part, not as the first part. And first, you need to do all that big picture conceptual stuff, and then you start drilling down. So with that said, before I kind of dive into some of the other pieces around documentation and good stories, let me pass it over to John for a few minutes, and then I'll pick up the thread later on.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Josh. And completely agree with a lot of the system agnostic and system specific issues and limitations that we see across many of the solutions that are out there. I think I'd also add that really having an implementation support partner also that already has that established and good working relationship with the software provider, and really knowing how that software provider manages and executes the implementation from their perspective really helps with the overall planning and project management from your implementation support partner. And building that working relationship and knowledge typically comes over time, and after working on a number of these engagements together. Something else that kind of goes hand in hand with performing a lot of these implementations that we have conducted is really a combination of the right subject matter expertise for all things like technical, like data mapping and testing, but also having that subject matter expertise from an end user perspective. So meaning like a former practitioner that has actually used the system, in a working production environment, and really combining that technical and end user expertise with the working relationships that we have with the vendors really has played a really big part in the success we have had in helping our clients with the implementation support.
All right. So the next piece that I mentioned was the documentation. And again, this is where sort of experience and having done this many, many, many times can be really helpful to our clients. There is a generally accepted suite of documentation that really needs to accompany systems and needs to accompany these kinds of programs. And it's very important to realize that from a regulator's perspective, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen and it doesn't exist. So from the perspective of a regulator, it's all about the documentation because after all, that's what regulators look at. Regulators can't come in and see what you did or understand what you did unless there's a document that tells them what you did. So understanding the importance of documenting the whole process of a systems implementation is sometimes an afterthought for people, and it really needs to not be an afterthought. And this, again, is one of those places where experience teaches you an awful lot. So when we come in, when AML RightSource helps a client with an implementation, we understand from the outset that there needs to be the appropriate risk assessments and coverage assessments and policies and procedures and desk manuals and issues management logs and all the various pieces of documentation that are going to explain to the regulator, hey, here's exactly what we did, here's what we decided, here's what happened along the way, here's the documentation that explains not only what we did, but what we expect our adjudicators and our staff to do once the system's ready and up and running. So making sure that all these supporting pieces and all of the documents that are required to make a system understandable to a regulator, I can't overstate the importance of that. Like I said, from a regulatory perspective, if there's not a document to explain it, it's as if it didn't happen. So not only do we understand this and can help guide our clients, but for every one of those document types I just named, whether it's a risk assessment or a desk manual or whatever it might be, we've written hundreds of them. And so we have templates that are ready to go. We can sort of help you plug in your information into the template so it's not like you're inventing something from scratch. And we can say to you, hey, listen, here are the 12 different documents you really should have in place if you're going to implement a new system. So that too, it just helps plug a lot of gaps and helps make sure that the whole package is compliant, not just the system itself, but all the things that surrounds the system. John, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, and thanks, Josh, and all great points. And really, I'll just add that there's a lot of new technology available on the market, and it can really make things difficult for decision makers, stakeholders, at financial institutions, to select the right solution. Ultimately, the main objective is really to have a system that's effective, efficient, meets the business requirements of the institution and also the regulatory requirements of the institution. There's certainly solutions that function the same, but it's important to note, no two solutions are really alike. And asking the right questions up front will only help you find the right solution that fits your institution. For example, if your current system has a limitation and you can't monitor for certain types of activity, it should be documented. You should have that outlined in your business requirements documentation. And you should ask the software vendor, how would they be able to monitor for those activity types? And not just ask them, but really have them show you during a demo of the solution, of how they could mitigate any of those identified issues that you have. You'd be surprised as to how many institutions we worked with that don't even have a business requirements doc. And there's certainly a lot of considerations that should be asked during the selection process, and really spending the time up front to develop a well thought out BRD, not only incorporates the current state of your program, but it should consider, the future state of your program and really where you think it will be in a couple years out. That way you can grow into the system and really, make sure that it does meet, those business requirements and those regulatory requirements that you have.
So ultimately, it's the financial organization's duty to ensure the system is safe, sound, and functioning correctly in line with regulations, correct? Which I suppose only further validates the need for implementation support.
Absolutely so. And building on what you just said, Rachel, and on what John was just saying, no system is perfect, right? And no system's ever going to do everything that you need it to for every different client in all circumstances. Such a system has yet to be invented. But like John was saying, that's okay as long as you acknowledge the limitations and document them. And to me, that kind of relates to the third and final point, which I brought up at the top, which is having a good story to tell the regulators. And I think this is a point that is really often overlooked. Regulators understand that no system's perfect, no institution's perfect. But if you can explain to them in a convincing and clear way why you did what you did, and why you made the choices you made, and why those make sense and are defensible, 99% of the time, regulators will be okay with that because they understand that no system's perfect, right? So if you can say, hey, you know what, the system we have, it just couldn't accommodate this particular thing. And so here's the manual control we put in place, or here's the mitigating control that sort of makes that risk an acceptable one for our institution. As long as you have a good, clear story to tell, as long as you're not sort of stumbling when they ask why this isn't addressed by your system and can give them a clear answer, it goes most of the way towards solving the problem.
Jonathan, do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, being transparent, and again, it goes back to what Josh mentioned about documentation, and really just documenting each step along the process, and being very transparent. If there are issues, document those issues, put a remediation or action plan together, and just present that in front of the regulators. I mean, they'll be okay with that as long as you have a plan in place, you've identified an issue, and again, it's transparency and documentation, I think is really important. to ultimately have that successful implementation and really get sign off from your either model risk management team, your regulators, internal external audit. It's just, certainly important to really just make sure you have everything, put into your methodology sound of how you perform the implementation, and really just, have the right folks involved in the project overall.
Well, thank you both for joining me again and sharing your knowledge. To our listeners, I hope that you found this valuable. Join us next time for our final episode on implementation support, where we discuss what to pay attention to and what to avoid.
Thanks for listening to this episode of AML Conversations, the Solution Series. More episodes will be posted in the coming months. If you find this installment interesting, there is more great content at amlrightsource.com. If we can help you with your financial crime compliance needs, schedule a meeting on our website. Together, we can reimagine compliance.